Okay. Terrific. Will everybody please be seated so we can get started? Don't ask me to treat you badly. I will not blink the lights. I will not clap my hands. I will not commend the people who are sitting in their seats waiting for this to start. Pretty soon I'm going to start calling names. Mary, sit down and shut up. Thank you. Do I need to call anybody else out? I was a principal. I take names. There we go. If you're sitting in the back and you're here for this panel discussion on philanthropy, we would love it if you could move forward, because it's very hard to talk to an audience spread all over the place. Gee, all those people leaving are going to miss all the money these philanthropists were going to give you if you stayed in the room. We appreciate you. The closer you sit, the more you get. Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Sellers now. We thank you very much for joining this session. This is the Philanthropists Roundtable called Give Till It Hurts, Matching Good Intentions with Good Results. Maybe the first question should be, does it really hurt when you give? I'm not sure that it does, but we'll get to that later. We have 4 exceptional philanthropists with us today who are doing amazing work both nationally and in the cities that where they operate. First of all, we have Heather Anacini, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Chicago Public Education Fund. Heather, welcome. We have Steve Arnold, Vice Chairman of George Lucas Educational Foundation and co-founder of Polaris Venture Partners. We have a very good friend of mine from my years in Washington, D.C., Catherine Bradley, the President of City Bridge Foundation. And we also have John Fisher, President of Pisces and Board Chair of the KIPP Foundation. And if you know anything about what's happening in innovation around the country, you know that these 4 individuals have had a lot to do with it. We thought it would be good to start our panel discussion today talking about how these 4 think about their investment philosophy and their theory of change, because that often drives what philanthropists do when they're making decisions about who and what to invest in. So I'm going to start right away with John. And John, will you mind opening us up and talking about how you think about this at Pisces and what your theory of change is and your investment philosophy?
Sure. So it looks like more people are interested in making money here, I guess, than giving it away. Maybe if they had changed the title, it eliminated philanthropy, and had been talked about, making great returns on investment by investing in education, we would have had a larger turnout. Because I think actually that is what we do. I see philanthropists in the name, and in many respects, I don't really even consider myself a philanthropist. I wear sort of the same hat when I'm quote unquote giving money away as I do when I'm investing money, and that is that I look for businesses or organizations that I think are in the right area, that have prospects for strong rates of return, however you judge what that return is going to be, that have very strong management. I look for governance and who's on the board. I look for whether they're sustainable and how much money is behind them. So I really do many of the same things when we're looking at investments in nonprofits as we do when we're investing in for-profits. Our theory of change has been, for those who I've met with a lot of you around this room already, but our theory of change, I guess, is really focused on charter schools. That we fundamentally believe that independently run schools that are schools of choice and that have to set high hurdles for performance and student achievement are the best way to both impact the public school system as well as to impact the individual kids and families' lives who attend those schools. So our focus really has all been around charters. Lately, we have sort of added to that focus by creating a nonprofit investment fund in the Bay Area called Silicon Schools Fund, which seeks to promote next generation schools by identifying promising entrepreneurs or those who are already running schools. They might be charters, they could be traditional public schools, they could be private schools that have models that we think drive student achievement and can do that on the California public dollar. So that has kind of been our focus. We've made sort of 4 investments to date. It's a $25 million fund, and we really look at it like any early stage venture capitalist would look at investing in early stage businesses, trying to find the right people, looking at results, focusing on data to the extent that it's available, and working with the entrepreneurs to help them develop their business plans.
Great, thank you, thank you. Catherine, why don't you talk about it from your perspective?
Sure, and this is going to sound just a little bit as an echo of what John just said, because the only way to understand CityBridge, my organization, is to understand that it came out of 2 best practices research businesses that my husband and I had. And if you're in the best practices research business, your training and your role is to go out there and find solutions to problems. We were doing it in business, but that same formula really applies in the nonprofit area. And what we tried to do in founding CityBridge was to pick up that DNA of being best practices researchers, looking for things that work to solve problems, and to put that frame down on the problem of the urban school system. So when you look at our team, we look the same as we looked when we were working in the business. We are researchers, we hire people for high talent, and then we turn them loose to find what we consider the best ideas in public education, and we want to bring them to DC. We want to invest in them to scale if they're already in DC. If they need incubation, we'll incubate them. If they need political connections or fundraising, we'll do that for them. We'll do about anything if that partner, whom we've identified, can add to the high-performing basis of Washington, D.C. We work in charter schools and in traditional public schools. In fact, we think they're really leveraged ideas in both. And if I had a theory of change to articulate, it is that the transformational school is the unit of change that's going to matter for changing urban schooling, that we cannot get there, I don't think, by systems reform alone, things that we do and then spread like peanut butter to the entirety of the district. We actually need to solve this problem by setting up and scaling individual transformational schools.
Heather, you run the Chicago Public Education Fund, so your focus in Chicago, maybe in some ways like Catherine is focused in DC. Can you talk about how you
In fact,
approach it?
we studied her a lot before we, not Heather, but the Chicago Public Education Fund before we set up
And that's an
CityBridge.
important to note about philanthropies, because generally they don't compete and they're open to learning from each other. Heather?
So you'd hear a lot of the same echoes in terms of the way we think about identifying ideas that are promising, management teams that are promising, and certainly the local focus that Catherine just mentioned. We are a really talent-focused organization, so Catherine talked about needing to scale transformational schools. We don't see any transformational schools, charter or district, that don't have transformational leadership. So principals and highly effective teachers that are making that transformation happen. And so the fund has spent a lot of time investing in that theory of change and bringing human capital organizations to the city of Chicago and helping them expand and scale. More recently in our history, we've started to think about the tools that those highly effective teachers and principals need to close the growth gap in their schools and classrooms, and so have started to invest in technologies or human capital approaches that help those great leaders on the public dollar meet the challenges that they're facing. And so some similarities in terms of our evolution as well.
Great. Steve, the Lucas Foundation approaches this very differently. You're an operating foundation. So can you talk about the unique perspective that you have related to this?
Yes. So as an operating foundation, we've asked a couple of questions. We say, as part of our kind of driving mission, a lot of people know education ought to be different, but they don't know in what way. So we try to do the research to identify programs that work in the real world, on the ground, and then give it away online through the website called edutopia.org. It basically is a resource. George used the metaphor one time, which some people winced at, but it's arming the foot soldiers of the revolution. We want the people on the ground, whether they're school leaders or teachers or even parents, to know what works and to insist on, to try what works and to insist on things which are proven to work. We stay away from the politics of education because we really believe that it matters what happens, what kids do, how they spend their time, what kinds of programs school leaders and educators are able to bring forward to create a transformative learning experience. The other thing we do as part of this operating foundation is we fund and undertake design-based research to help investigate and validate operating principles, whether it's curriculum or other kinds of programs, which we can, through our own evidence and our own research, identify as things that make a difference. And then again, give it away to try to make the resources available to anybody who's interested. We have, just as a benchmark, about 1 million visits a month to edutopia.org and a few 100,000 other people that are using social media and mobile media to try to get access to the information. But we are huge networkers and supporters of that which works, and we want more people to know about it and then to be able to use it in their own context.
Are philanthropies a target audience for you?
For us,
Yep.
philanthropies are one of the target audiences because we like to encourage investment in innovation. And all these folks have said they pay attention to what works, they want to invest in what works, and so to the extent that we're helping to identify things that work through our research, through our evaluation, through our documentary films, through our writing materials, then hopefully it can at least inform some of our colleagues who actually are putting dollars to work to help build those transformative environments.
So this conference is built on the notion of education and innovation. And we've seen today and yesterday, and we'll see tomorrow, lots of people who are funding innovation and lots of entrepreneurs who are seeking to get funded to scale their innovations. Philanthropies usually take somewhat, I'll say, or take a different place in that whole capital arena, if you will. And yet I heard John talk about that he and his foundation approach philanthropy as maybe any investor would. Catherine, you've spoken about the importance of research driving what you do. I'll start with you, Catherine, and then come to you, John. How do you define innovation? How do you know it when you see it? How do you measure it? And how do you decide whether you're going to invest in it?
So there are a lot of different ways to answer that question, because in some ways, right now in the urban marketplace of most schools, any school that is really succeeding with low-income kids is an innovator and is doing something magical and wonderful that we should all be getting behind. But I think in the context of this conference, we think about innovation as using technology to radically rethink the design of a school. And so we have really looked in DC and said, all right, which schools or which individual leaders have ideas that are using technology to radically change what school is going to look like. And if we believe in the leadership caliber, we will get behind that experiment. So we have funded a few things in DC. We funded Joel Rose and School of One, which has one DC replication. We are funding an entrepreneurial startup, which will be the first high-performing charter, fully blended learning model in Washington, DC. And then we did something else, which maybe I'll talk about more later. We realized that philanthropy was getting far ahead of practice in terms of what we knew and what we had learned about that was possible. Everything we've talked about here at this whole conference wasn't really being implemented in most of our schools, or if it was very, very small. So we created a competitive fellowship for teacher leaders in the city, and that fellowship launched in January. It has been really successful so far. They have a full day of release time a month, plus they spend a couple evenings with us. They spent spring break in California and Silicon Valley and LA with us. They are all required to start a technology-related pilot in their schools this summer, and then with their principals' blessing and backing, to actually change a significant part of their practice starting next fall in their classrooms. And it's having the effect that we wanted. We are, through this fellowship, we hope, injecting significant differences in practice and innovative practice into 12 schools, and then we have plans to expand it pretty significantly starting next year.
John, how do you approach it? You've been really largely, and at least from a leadership point of view, a major force in the success and the growth of KIPP. And KIPP hasn't necessarily been known for its technological innovation. It's been a culture-driven system of schools. How do you think about innovation, particularly as it relates to KIPP and then the new initiative that you talked about earlier?
It's a good question, because when you have a formula that seems to be working pretty well, Brian, what do you call it? The something dilemma? Innovator's dilemma. When you have something that's working well, it's hard to sort of take the risk to change that model. And there's a lot of pressures on KIPP, but a lot of pressures on any charter school leader or CMO to, they have to be able to perform. They're working their teachers very, very hard. They're dealing with kids who are coming in sometimes many grade levels below where they need to be, and so there truly is when something is working, it truly is sort of difficult for them to sort of take the risk to try new things. In an effort to sort of push that along, we established some grants to various KIPP regions as and sort of in some respects like a race to the top type of formula, where for not a huge amount of money, you can get organizations that might otherwise be sort of have a difficulty changing their existing formula to be able to sort of think outside of what they're doing. And so those kind of innovation grants, which have been furthered by the Mortgage Foundation as well as Gates, have actually had a big impact on a number of our regions to develop sort of new plans focused on blended learning.
Heather, as you think about Chicago and the innovation you want to see there, how do you approach it from your perspective? And do you approach it the same way that Catherine does, or the same way that John does, or do you have a different approach given your role? I mean, you're the public education fund. What does that mean, and how does that influence how you think about innovation?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly means that we start by looking at the transformational schools that exist. So 10 years ago, if you had said radically rethink school, that might have meant something different from what it means today, because 10 years ago, people hadn't even started to radically rethink outcomes for kids. We didn't have the proof points of the KIPPs of the world or the Noble Streets in Chicago that we have today, or of the traditional district schools that are getting the work done. And so now that we have examples, we've got about 40 schools that we think are transformational truly in the city of Chicago, both district and charter schools, all led by truly transformational leaders. You start to do the research and uncover what's going on in those schools, and in many cases, the innovations that they're applying are really about radically transforming outcomes, not radically transforming schools. And in many cases, what they're doing isn't sustainable or scalable on what we've got to offer from a per pupil standpoint in the city of Chicago. We don't have the luxury citywide of having a network like KIPP of that size, of that scale, to be able to tap into and say, all right, let's do a race to the top, or let's do some kind of innovation grant kind of program and see what people come up with. And so we've been landing in many ways in the same place that I think Catherine was just describing, which is to say philanthropy might in Chicago be out a little bit ahead of what schools are doing or ready to do outside of this small pocket of transformation. So let's really connect high potential, highly effective leaders and leadership teams with new ideas and see what's possible in terms of transforming not just student outcomes, but transforming what school looks like. We've been wrestling a lot with exactly how to approach that. It's something I talked to Catherine about yesterday. And I think that's a place where philanthropy can start to lead in a way that traditional districts can follow. We care about all public schools in the city of Chicago, both the charter community and the traditional district community, but it's really important to us that whatever we figure out on the innovation side can be applied in reasonable ways at a large bureaucratic scale, not just at a small network scale or just in a charter community.
So Steve, you've heard all of these people that are giving their, making investments directly to organizations and trying to get behind and invest in things that they see are innovative. You approach it in a different way, as we've learned. How do you respond to this? And then I'll ask all of you, so that I don't control this too much, to respond to each other, and I'll throw a question out after you speak.
I would say there's a lot of similarity of objective, because what we're all trying to do is identify programs that work and that can work or be deployable at scale. One of the metaphors we've used in our research, for example, is adapted from some of the work I used to do in investing in health sciences and medical technology, where if you really want to change the standard of care in medicine, you have to have a pretty strong evidence base, and then you have to change a bunch of people's assumptions about what works in order to actually change behavior over time. But I think that some of the way that we define some of our research investments is at that level. We want to change a standard of practice. Therefore, we need to build the evidence base that says, here's why you should do more of this, because it works, and here's the evidence to support it, and here's the methodology that allows you to carry it forward. So in that sense, we're not different in our objective. We are different maybe in our tactic, because we're either funding design-based research and doing comparative studies to be able to assert that here's the evidence that this thing works better, and then encourage people to do it. But we also recognize that when we're out in the field, we're not inventing new things. We're in fact identifying things that are already there, and then doing the analysis to say, here's why that works, here's the research to back it up, now try it out. And here are the tools that you might need in order to be a grassroots revolutionary in your own context, whatever that means. So we hope that it's an accessible resource for anybody who wants to drive change to find something of value. And so in that sense, I think we're sort of at least spiritually aligned with their initiatives, and hopefully some of what we've discovered and made available is useful in some of what they're trying to do.
So let's take that and let's talk about the dark side of philanthropy. So the power of giving is a very strong force. And often the rap on philanthropy is that when you begin working with, when we begin working with a potential organization, a partner, that we, with our own aims, our own desires, and own choices, corrupt their aspirations. They want our money, they want our brand, they want to use our money to leverage other money, and therefore we always have the best haircuts, we're the best dressed, we have the funniest jokes and the greatest insights you could ever possibly imagine, which we all know is not true, except for Kathy. And how do you respond to that? And do you see that corrupting influence, and how do you deal with it so that you can achieve the objectives that who you invest in are trying to achieve and the ones that you're trying to achieve? I'll let anybody jump on that.
Go ahead.
No.
I was going to say, I'm going to tell a story out of a different context, because I think it's a really interesting question. So in another context, in addition to my work with the George Lucas Foundation, I am on several other education boards. And I have found myself on the other side of a fundraising challenge on another project that I'm working on. And the way I describe it somewhat cynically is I go talk to people, and if I read what they say they do, it looks to me like they ought to want to do the thing that I got. So I go talk to them, and I tell them what we're doing, and I show them the data and try to describe it. And my cynical story is, and they say, you have made the best blue-green thing we have ever seen. Of course, we only fund green-blue, but that's a really good blue-green. And so one of the frustrations for somebody who's trying to innovate is actually figuring out how to package the story to be able to get somebody to sign up without becoming the thing you don't want to be, to become the thing that they already think they want, rather than figuring out how to help them understand the value of the thing you're doing. It's a huge magnetic pull, which is a huge challenge, I think, and I've seen it on the other side with other people who are willing to become the thing they think you want, which turns out to be not the thing that they should be doing. So I've just been on the other side of it, and I see the frustration.
Yeah, but I think the funding community, if you've been doing this long enough, you get a really good radar for someone who is trying to contort what it is they should be doing in order to be able to apply to your grant or to meet your criteria. And you can end up wasting a lot of money and everybody's time if you do that a lot. I think for my group, we've tried to be really, really sensitive to this, and try to remind ourselves all the time, our jokes are really not that good, our ideas are really not as good as everybody tells us that they are, and to try to stay a little humble, because if you're not humble, we can't get this work done well. We can't work with kids in low-income communities if we think we're so great. And we have a clear set of values for City Bridge, and one of them, I promise this is pre-Sheryl Sandberg, is lean forward. That I want everyone on my team always leaning forward. We call it running to criticism or leaning forward, never being back on your laurels, being comfortable. And I think one of the things that helps us stay leaning forward is that we are having to raise money more than, in fact, we are giving money away. So we're out there asking and convincing and making the case all the times ourselves, because most of what we need to get done in Washington is larger than we can do ourselves. So because I'm always on the other side of the table too, I try to be really sensitive when I am on the funder side of the table to be respectful. I don't know that it always works, because we're all susceptible to our jokes being better than they are. But it starts by being honest with ourselves that we're in this unique position.
John, do you deal with that problem?
You know, I'm bald, if you didn't see, so not much that people can do to compliment me. Actually, I'm fine if they want to say great things about me. I mean, why not? I guess I'll answer it in a somewhat different way, which is there's a lot of incentive for donors to think that we know best. And so, for us specifically, whether it's KIPP schools or other schools that we fund, we will look at things. It may be a software package. It may be it may be advocacy. It may be there are a whole number of different things that we will sort of look at. And our schools will say, well, we don't have the money. We don't have the money to afford them. And so we say, oh, well, that's okay. We'll pay for it. And if you'll use it. And the feedback oftentimes is, well, that's great. But I often wonder, am I better off giving that extra dollar to the school themselves and letting them make the asset allocation, make the decision about what is in their own best interests, as opposed to me on the outside making that sort of that decision for them. And so, and it sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes sort of the innovator's dilemma prevents the organization from actually doing things. Sometimes the philanthropist probably does know best. Probably can look outside of the trees and see where we need to go in the next 5 years, and can kind of use our capital and our words as leverage to try and move some of these organizations along. But sometimes we don't. Sometimes we push them in directions that they shouldn't probably be going in, just because we think it's the right thing to do.
Heather, and then Steve.
It's interesting because being a local education fund, there are organizations that have to contort if they want to sort of achieve the outcomes that they say they can achieve in the city of Chicago. And so we try really hard to dig in very deep with the organizations where we think we might invest before we make that investment. help them understand better the landscape, help us understand better their team and their vision. And I think that process and the way we invest, usually over a 2 or a 3 year period of time with benchmarks built in along the way, allows us to make sure that the contortions we might be asking for are ones that will make them better able to achieve our shared outcomes in the context we're talking about. Because we are bringing national organizations off into Chicago. And then the second thing, and this has been really new for us, in the last year, we've just tried to spend a lot more time in the schools where we have leaders and teachers, and in the schools where we're introducing innovations and hearing from those folks and making sure that the organizations we're invested in are hearing from those folks about the things that are working and aren't working. So to the humility point, I think it's, you know, as much about just showing up and watching and listening as it is about sort of having a conversation in my office with the founder of the organization.
And Heather, you're also on both sides of the table the way we are too,
Yes.
because you're having to raise money and you're making big decisions about giving it away.
Yes.
I was going to say, one of the things I like about what everybody's saying up here is everybody's thinking about this not as grants, but as about investments, which means everybody is very attentive to the so what of what happens as a result of doing what you do. And the other, but I think another important thing about all of us trying to make things different is everybody knows what the innovator's dilemma is, which John framed earlier, which is the tendency to hold on to what works, even if something else might work better. So one of the nice roles that philanthropy can do, either in the investment side of funding organizations to try something new, or in the case of our work at the Lucas Foundation, to go find and provide the data set to say this is something that works, is reduce by a little bit the risk of trying something new. And also be willing to allow for failure in order to get better. One of the sort of watchwords that you think about sometimes is if what you're doing doesn't work, try something else. But if what you're doing works okay but not great, it's not good enough to just sort of sit back and say, well, that's good enough, if in fact the outcome you're trying to achieve is kids who have the capacity to participate in the society into which they're going to be thrust. That's a very different outcome. Can you pass the test or pass the grade? And so you really have a definition of success that requires a pretty high-reaching set of goals, and then the strategies and tactics down below to actually how to implement that. So,
But don't you want to stress some of these organizations? Don't you want to really push them to achieve the set of outcomes that you want? And how far are you willing to go with them to really stress them to produce what they said they would produce and what they committed through an investment agreement or a grant fund agreement or however you do it? Don't you want them to really push hard? And aren't you an external force to make them get to those outcomes that you're investing in? And how far will you take it?
I mean, I'll answer that for pace of change, that we're often in the position of pushing the high performers in DC to scale and grow often faster than they want to. And there are wise voices I often listen to who saying, don't push too hard, because scaling and growth that is beyond the capacity of these organizations will just kill the formula here. But there are very few forces pushing high performers to grow and grow faster and to get the conditions right on the ground so that that growth can happen. So I'm very comfortable that even if I'm pushing some people a little bit harder than they'd like to be pushed, it's the right thing for the city. You know, Heather, you talked about having 40 transformational schools out of how many in Chicago?
680.
Okay, so we have about 16 or 18 out of about 200, and I track this really, really carefully. There is going to be a point that these cities hit tipping points, after which this work gets much, much easier. When something like 30, I'll just put this out because the military uses this number a lot, something like 30% of our schools that serve low-income kids are transformative, the whole conversation's gonna change. So I feel like anything I do, anything I can do to push that pace of change to get to that 30%, if that's the right number, tipping point, I should be doing it because that outcome is the most important thing, even if it means we've pushed too hard in a few cases.
and the sooner the better.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
it would be worth probably, just because you have a measure for this, to say, what do you mean, how do you define a transformative school or transformational school in your network? And maybe you would say the same thing, because that's a metric that you have a data set around or a set of assumptions around that might help frame
Yeah.
that. I think would be helpful.
I mean, they're obviously it's more nuanced than this,
Sure.
but We look at the way that the city categorizes a school. We categorize in 4 tiers, and a tier 1 school is a school where at least 60% of the kids in that school are operating at proficient or better. And we have a pretty hard test, so relative to other states. Then City Bridge puts an additional frame on top of that to get our 16 to 18. Are you serving the average percent poverty in the city or higher, which is 76%? So when I say 16 to 18 schools, it means floor of 76% free, floor of 76% free and reduced price lunch and floor of 60% proficient.
And we look a little bit differently because our test in Illinois is notoriously not strong. So we look at also at least the average free and reduced lunch, a non-selective school, meaning folks are pulling from the general pool and general population, and putting kids by the end of 8th grade on track to a college-ready ACT score, or by the end of 12th grade with a college-ready ACT score. That's not the only metric we use, but that's sort of the driving one.
John, you started this conversation talking about the way that you approach investing is very similar to how some of the other investment people that are here at this conference approach investment. So let's kind of talk about the entrepreneurs that are here, many of whom are for-profit startup companies who, like their nonprofit social entrepreneurs, want to change the world. What's the interplay between philanthropy and these for-profit innovators and the financial world that gets behind them, and how do you see that playing? And is there a leverage there? Do you operate completely outside of that realm? And do you see some of these high-performing organizations that may be here or that are very promising part of your portfolio or your future? Or are they part of what you're doing right now? And how does that interplay work? John, you want to take that first?
I guess the answer is I really don't know. I think the idea, if we're going to see real innovation take place, it's going to have to come from the for-profit sector. The nonprofit sector just isn't big enough. It's not greedy enough. It's probably not smart enough. What ultimately drives innovation taking place, it's not the government sector, and it's not the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector did not invent the iPad, and so the question is, so I think it's great that we're in a conference where most of the people are out there trying to figure out how they can get rich off of investing in sort of companies that are trying to make money off of all this. I think that's great. The question is, when can that happen? Because we have a system right now that is a monopoly. And monopolies, if it's hard enough to get some of the nonprofits to innovate, it's really hard to get the school districts to innovate, unless, of course, you've got sort of dictatorial leadership forcing them to do it. And so the question is, can nonprofit capital be sort of, can we take risks that for-profits wouldn't take? Can we somehow be a bridge to a market that's going to really drive all the innovation, and how long will that take? I don't know. If we had a truly open system of education the way we do in most other industries in the United States, where consumers are the driving force, then I'd say, well, then innovation, that's a given. But we're really talking about, for the most part, selling products to monopolies, and I haven't quite figured out how that works.
And the additional challenge there is that the person who's the user isn't the buyer.
Right.
And so you have multiple layers where where the traditional for-profit economic model actually don't work, because the customer doesn't behave the way a customer does in a situation where choosing the best product is actually what your goal is.
So taking that, and maybe Heather, you have another point of view. It looked like you were about to say something. How do we reach the level that we all want to get to? What is the role for these for-profit entrepreneurs in schools? Because basically we have a relatively monopolistic system of textbooks and instructional materials, which are basically sold to most every school district in the country by three or four companies. And they have a stranglehold on everything that your average school district does. So how, if this conference is determined to create a different model of delivering high-quality instruction to kids and to teachers, how do you interplay with it? Is there something you can do, or do we operate along separate streams?
So,
Heather, how do you think about it in Chicago?
yeah, so the nonprofit sector didn't invent the iPad, but it did invent KIPP. And it did invent Teach for America, and it did invent a lot of the organizations that are allowing for transformative schools today. So I think that's an important thing and a connection that philanthropy has to the community that we can help make. The second point, and I heard Ben Rayer make it earlier and others too, is that very few of the people that are at this conference from the technology side are talking about how much time they're spending in schools and classrooms, many different kinds of schools and classrooms, not just testing their product, but making sure that their product is flexible and nimble and can contort to operate in whatever the context is where the end user exists. And I think philanthropy can definitely bridge, and I think some of what Catherine's doing with her teacher ambassador fellowship program is a piece of that, can bridge between those high quality schools and those high quality principals and kind of work around the monopoly. Connect them with the ideas that exist in the for-profit sector and those things that you're seeing actually work in real, reasonable ways. And those of us that are on the ground in individual cities have a particularly important, I think, role to play, because we can sort of say, in this city, the 2 or 3 things that people need most right now are these. And the 2 or 3 ideas or for-profit concepts that are making that happen are these. And so let's start making some of those real connections.
Yeah, I have no problem with philanthropy giving money to a for-profit if they are providing an essential service for schools. We invested in wireless. I kind of think in my own head, all right, Larry Berger was here a moment ago. He's not still here, is he? So we invested in wireless, and why were we able to do that? Well, because we took 2 companies, my husband and I did public, in 1999 and in 2001, and that created the capital with which we're able to go and concentrate on solving this problem. So I'm perfectly comfortable giving Larry philanthropic dollars, and I really hope that after Larry then does his sale to News Corp, he turns around and he pays it forward as well, just because that's the way that I think that that we all can feel fine about investing in for-profits if there's some good citizenship on the back end as well. We took all of our education innovation fellows to News Corp. I wanted them to see all the different products that are out there. We took them to Silicon Valley, and they met with for-profit companies creating the tools that they will then be able to use in their classrooms. There's no way we can wall off these 2 worlds, and if philanthropy pretends that the only way to solve this is to invest in not-for-profits, I think we're leaving too many good ideas on the table.
Steve, are you in a position to really kind of stimulate this kind of conversation?
Well, the thing I was thinking, as other people were talking, the thing I was thinking, which is a little bit derived from what we do at the George Lucas Foundation, but we always say our tagline is what works in education. And what we do is try to identify that stuff which works and then make the information available. But I think one of the characteristics of this market that maybe could benefit from philanthropic investment is a dispassionate assessment of what works in terms of products. Because I think we have a situation where stuff is being sold with the behavior of a default sale. Because somebody else bought it, that's the reason why, because it's already out there. But nobody's actually rigorously assessing whether it actually accomplishes the goal. So that would be a place where philanthropy could change the dynamic of the for-profit marketplace in a way that might be really constructive. As an extension of the idea of if you know what works, it's hard to sell the thing that doesn't. I had a conversation earlier today with somebody, specifics to go unnamed, that was talking to me about a very successful education investment where a lot of people made a lot of money, and then they finally discovered that the kids actually weren't learning anything. Well, that's a bit of a problem if you have a mission-driven business of actually making education good, it's not good enough just to make money. You gotta make money building a business that actually does what you said. And that requires maybe not perfect knowledge, but greater knowledge than we have about what works. So asking that question or assessing even the stuff that's in the marketplace today with some kind of rigor might be a contribution that philanthropy could make that's disruptive in a good way to the for-profit business, because then you have to actually deliver in order to be able to be in the marketplace. So,
But Steve, if the business that those people funded and they made a lot of money out of ultimately isn't doing a good job, it's gonna go out of business.
yes, in
So-
theory.
So the system works.
Well, but people still sell a lot of products that aren't
Whereas
very good.
philanthropy, well, philanthropy continues to fund things that don't work.
Right, correct?
Forever.
What?
When was the last time you saw a philanthropic organization close or merge with somebody else?
They don't very
It almost
often.
never happens.
That's true.
You know, you talk about 9 out of 10 businesses fail. I haven't seen 9 out of 10 philanthropies fail.
No, but they're also not necessarily assessing themselves against the standard of what works, right? They're giving away money, but they're not necessarily being driven by the criteria that you have.
Sometimes it's hard to, right? I mean, the
Understood.
fun thing about
Yeah.
about for-profit businesses
Yeah.
is at the end of the day, it's pretty easy to assess them over the long term. It's pretty easy to assess whether something's working or not.
Right.
But when
Well-
you're backing a philanthropic organization, you have multiple goals in mind. It's not just, how many kids in 8th grade are testing at grade level. It's not necessarily just what your graduation rates are. I mean, these are all things that are important to care.
Right.
But it's character, and it's and it's a lot of other things that kind of show up that are not always easy to judge on pure data.
Right, but my argument was not about, I was actually talking about the for-profit product marketplace, because in fact, if you had better data on what products worked, it would be easier for you to encourage your high-performing school leaders to do stuff, because.
That's true.
So that's all I'm saying. I'm not, I wouldn't argue that trying to do complex system-level development at the philanthropic level, which is what KIP and you all are trying to do in your communities, is not a good thing. But if you had better information about products, it would be easier to do risk-taking.
Like
So
Catherine, you
this
were-
is just a
yeah.
particular point of opportunity, I think, in terms of where philanthropic investment could intersect with helping to influence a for-profit marketplace in a way that actually would be good for everybody. Because the crappy stuff gets flipped out earlier or makes itself good earlier because there's some way to think about it, and people are willing to take the risk to try something that has better data. And everybody keeps talking about data, but the question is data to do what? And so one of the things we have to figure out is how to make sure that the data being collected is actually useful to change outcomes, which means changing practice, which means changing system-level use of the data in a way that's constructive. So that was.
Catherine, you were going to jump
Yeah, no,
on
I
it.
was going to build off of something that John just said about do kind of philanthropies ever shut down, or we keep investing in things that are not really working. And it's almost easier with a for-profit product, if it's not working, to put out data saying this is bad, let's stop doing it. It's really hard when it's a nonprofit doing hard work in a community to say, shouldn't be doing that anymore. And along these lines, I have become a complete Grinch in the Washington community recently, because I've been doing this work long enough that I have come to the conclusion that all the nonprofits which do individual work with kids, often great work with individual kids, remediating a handful of kids at underperforming schools, I've decided that they're all part of the problem, not part of the solution. And this is a really hard thing to say, because what I'm really advocating for is stop remediating a handful of kids in bad schools. Those schools should close or be completely transformed. And when we remediate a handful of kids, what we're really doing is propping up that bad school and allowing it to stay open longer. So I have become a major Grinch, and it's a little bit of a difficult position for somebody in philanthropy. We don't generally criticize, we generally just cheerlead. And especially we cheerlead people doing the hardest work with the hardest kids in our hardest schools. But with enough perspective, and with this frame in my own head of how do we get to that tipping point of 30% of our schools being transformational schools in the city, I know we don't get there by remediating individual kids.
So we're nearly out of time, so I'm going to ask all four of you to speak to a couple of the themes at this conference in a very short way. Talk about this concept of return on education or knowledge as currency, as we've heard today, and how you view it from your perspective. Heather, you want to start?
Yeah, I think, our understanding of return on education has really evolved over the course of a decade, and we're focused a lot more now on what Catherine just talked about, and I think organizations that want to get involved with organizations like ours need to be focused there too, and that's how do we get to transformational schools, and many more transformational schools in cities like Chicago. Individual ideas that tackle one small piece of the problem aren't going to get us there. We have to really think, at least at the school level, in terms of the return that we're hoping to get.
John?
I guess I think that, the technology and all the support for the technology that's happening at conferences like this and elsewhere is ultimately a really good thing if those companies who are providing a good service can ultimately figure out how to make money doing it. And that means that they, today, with less than or about 5% of kids in charter schools, maybe a little more than that, that means that those companies have to be able to sell into school districts. And so then that brings you to the question of, can you put enough pressure on school districts or reform them well enough that they will act like good consumers of products? And if they do, well, then that's great news. And if they don't, then it'll be a long time as more and more independent schools take more and more market share because they presumably will act in the child's best interests.
Great. Steve?
I think this is a great question. First of all, I think this conference is an awesome event, I should say. Shout out to the people that put it together. In 4 years, this has turned into a really interesting forum to have this conversation and to awaken people. So one of the things I look at in terms of the return on education is replication and scalability, because I think almost exactly what you're saying about doing a great thing with a few kids is a worthy thing, but if it's not replicable and scalable, then we still haven't solved the problem. So that's how I'm looking at it, and that's why I think evidence is so important and accessibility is so important for the innovations, is because if we can't do it at scale, we can't write off 2 or 3 generations of kids while we get it right.
And Catherine?
So, the work that we're all doing is all about unlocking the potential in every single child. And I think my frame on that, I think a lot of us at this table share, is that the best unit of change to get that work done is at the level of the school. And I look at that and I say, okay, what are some of the things that transformational schools need that they generally can't just get on their own? And I take it down to 2 things only that we will do across the whole system. And one is they need access to talent. This work just does not get done without fantastic people. So we will work on talent things across the entirety of our system because transformational schools can't exist without that. And then the second thing is tools. They can't wake up in the morning and say, I need a tool to personalize learning for my kids. I need a tool for data if those tools haven't been created by someone and we haven't created a market to get them to school. So we will only do work that is about the transformational school, and the only systems-wide things we do are talent and tools. And I think this conference has been awesome. I wish I'd had time to go and actually see all these great things that are being created out there.
Somebody will bring them to you, though.
Probably.
Well, let's thank our panelists. And I want to thank each and every one of you. And I will say this, and I think it doesn't get said often enough these days in the debates that we have. The families that are represented here don't have to do this. The Fisher family, the Bradley family, the Lucas family. I'll get to you, Heather, in a minute. They don't have to do this. They do this because they choose to do it. And they choose to give in very large amounts to these things that are very important to our communities and our nation, and do it without seeking accolades and do it without seeking credit. And so, having worked with them, most of them are their organizations at some time in my life. I just want to say thank you for all that you've done for this country and for your communities and for your cities. And I know how hard it is to run a public education fund and how hard it is to get people to get you the resources you need to do what you do. So I admire the work you do as well, Heather. Thank you all very much.
You guys do great work. I'm involved in another project that is in Chicago.
Oh, which one?
The castle, the